Good morning. It is the 13th of April, 2016, and I am beginning recording what I recollect of our Feehan family history. I want to apologize at the beginning for the hesitancy of this tale. I would like to be telling it in a more fluid fashion, but given that I had a heart attack and 2 strokes in January, I don't feel like my ability to tell this story is nearly as good as it would have been maybe 6 months or a year ago. Nevertheless, I want to get this down as a recording because I am scheduled for bypass surgery sometime in mid-May, and I am worried that maybe another stroke could wipe out a good part of my memory. So I want to make sure I record as much as I can while I'm still able to do so. So I'm going to be recording this in a series of chapters, and with a dedication to my sons, Kelly and John, and to my grandchildren, Tristan, Amadeus, Mitchell, Sebastian, and Isabel, and to Blaine as well, and to all of the nieces and nephews of my brothers and sister. The intent here is to give you as much as I can about the Feehan history as I know it, and to tell you a little bit about my personal history, because I often had curiosity about my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and I never had the chance to ask them or listen to them except for the recording that's on YouTube right now of my mom and dad. So with that, this is chapter 1. As I said, it is April 13th, 2016. It's a little after 10 o'clock in the morning, and I hope this is at least of some value and interest to all of you. I really began taking an interest in the Feehan family history, I think, for 2 reasons. One is that I was quite close to my Aunt Dessa, and Dessa was the family genealogist, the family historian, and Dessa is my dad's oldest sister, and so she collected as much information from memory as she could and from her trips to Ireland and wrote down what she could. And also I had the opportunity to attend a Minsky family reunion in southern Minnesota several years ago, and actually attended a couple of those, and I have a great deal of information on the Minsky side of the family as well. So to begin, as I said, Dessa inspired me to look into the family history when she gave me a paper with her recollection of the family's history. She had some not very reliable information about where the Feehan family name came from, and she had a belief that it came from O'Phaohan, who was a son of a king of Ireland back in perhaps in the 1300s, and may have been descended from the Moors who actually invaded Ireland. They were the Moors invaded Spain and eventually made their way to Ireland, as we're told. Anyway, what also added to my interest was that in 1985 I had an opportunity to travel to Ireland for the first time with Dr. James Cunningham, who was my advisor at the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work and who is doing a research project. Jim and I, along with Dennis Candy, who became a very close friend, traveled to Ireland and spent time in Dublin and some other towns in Ireland, and then eventually traveled to the West Coast together. So that's where all of this comes from, and I have boxes and boxes of family history. I'm going to try to organize those while I'm recovering from surgery and hopefully be able to provide family members with a much more accurate picture of our family's history. Um, what we do know is that on my dad's side of the family, the Fians, we believe that they came from the county Offaly, which is a farming county midway between Galway and Dublin. And I will talk about John Fian, whom we believe is a cousin, and who we've had much contact with over the years, but who did a study of the of the baptismal records and found that there was a John Fian who was born in 1831 in Rahan, Rahan, which is a tiny village about 5 miles west of Tullamore in County Offaly. And this seems to be the most logical or most reasonable evidence of John Fian being born in Ireland, although it doesn't quite match up with what we know or what we think we know about his year of birth based on the records in Corcoran. So that's perhaps where the Fians originated. We think County Offaly is right, and we think that this could be the John Fian that's our great-grandfather. On my mother's side of the family, the Minskys came along with two other families from some small villages in what was then called East Prussia. And Prussia was one of the areas that eventually made up Germany, but this area in particular becomes absorbed as part of Poland in the reorganization after World War II. So the village is called Königsberg, and the other village is Nordhausen, and that's where these three families, the Minskys, the Marzans, and the Connies, all came from. The reason we know so much about them is because many years ago, a woman visited our family when we lived on 53rd and Logan, from who represents these three families and the groups that they put together over the years, and she brought a blue-bound, hand-bound book that we have copies of that outline the Minsky family history very clearly. And the families, the three families, migrated apparently around 1855 and made their way to Wisconsin, at which point I think they got there by rail, and then they purchased covered wagons for the trip west to Minnesota, where they homesteaded around Morristown and Waseca. And so we know a lot about the Minsky family history, where they settled, where their farms were, what kinds of lives they led. And we have a kind of a family lore that the Minsky name originated from the town of Minsk in Russia, and that the Minskys were possibly at one time of Jewish origin and maybe converted to Christianity before they came to the United States. We don't know that for sure. I've done a DNA swab with familyhistory.com, and I'm checking into that to see if there's any indication in DNA that we are of Jewish descent. So the story then begins to unfold as we look at the settlement in Corcoran, and we see that John Fian of possibly County Offaly, arrives around the time just before the Civil War, around probably around 1855, and settles in Corcoran. But according to family lore, when he came to the area of Minnesota and was looking for property, he had been evidently living in Chicago and earning some money, and apparently married there. He was convinced that he should buy some property, and he was perhaps working in one of the mills in along the river, and he was looking at a house to buy where the Nicollet Hotel now sits, or where it was located, near Nicollet and Washington Avenue in downtown Minneapolis. But he had the opportunity to homestead, which was a law passed in the United States encouraging settlers to farm in the area that was now being settled after or around the time of the Civil War. And he elected to homestead some property in Corcoran, Minnesota. Of course, there was no town of Corcoran at the time. The town of Corcoran was named after Pat Corcoran, who was the first postmaster and who apparently was friends with John Feehan. So they, along with a number of other families, homesteaded, which meant that they acquired land which they had to clear and farm. And John was married, had a number of children, and those children are recorded in our family history. And one of those was John Feehan, my grandfather. My grandfather met the Conley family, possibly in Chicago, and married Kate Conley. And Kate Conley, my grandmother, was alive at the time I was born, but my grandfather, John Feehan, had died the year before I was born, as did my grandfather, Laird Minsky. And we know that Laird Minsky was in Georgia at the time and suffered an embolism, I think. He had a heart attack, probably from a blood clot that resulted from some surgery he had on a mole on his head. And so I never got to meet either of my grandfathers, but both of my grandmothers were alive. My grandmother, Kate Conley, was living on 29th and Queen at the time, but she was an invalid. She was in a wheelchair. She had suffered from pernicious anemia, and she was kindly, very loving grandmother, used to give me nickels and dimes when I would come over. But she was not in good health, and I never had much of a chance to talk to her. My grandmother, Maida Minsky, on the other hand, my mother's mother, was very close to me, and she had moved in with the family when my father went in the service in 1944, I believe, just toward the end of the World War II. We were living on 32nd and Aldrich at the time, 3235 Aldrich, I believe. It was in the lower level of a duplex, and it was a one-bedroom apartment. So my mom and dad had already had Pat, my brother Pat, my sister Kit, and myself, and my mom had also just had my brother Kerry. So there were 4 children and my grandmother living with us. And of course, before my dad went in the service, he was living there, living in a one-bedroom apartment, which you can imagine was very cramped. And when my dad returned from the service, we were looking for a place to live, and the city had just helped to build a new project for veterans, basically, along the river called the Mississippi Courts, and we moved into the Mississippi Courts in 1949. We thought it was wonderful. It was a brand new apartment. It was a 3-bedroom apartment, so we had much more room, and it was located right on the Mississippi River. So we had the opportunity to live in not only a new apartment, but around a lot of other families with kids, which was great. And living close to the river was kind of like a Huck Finn existence. We had rafts on the river. We would go fishing on the river, and it was a great way to grow up at that age. There was also a new Catholic church and school built somewhat to the west, maybe a mile to the west, called Our Lady of Victory. And my father joined the church. Of course, they did not have a kindergarten, so we ended up as kids going to the public school, Jenny Lind, and for kindergarten. And then after kindergarten, we went to Our Lady of Victory for first grade through eighth grade. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. The Fians and the Minskys were North Minneapolis families, and they were very had friends and neighbors that they were involved with around the north side. My dad was a fireman. After he completed his tour of duty with the U.S. Army and came back, he was able to join the Minneapolis Fire Department, where he served until he retired. And my grandmother, Maida, got a job at the telephone company, Northwestern Bell. She worked downtown. And I remember fondly going downtown to visit her at work. She worked in the cafeteria, so I was able to eat lunch with her and enjoyed that. And occasionally she would take me to the Forum cafeteria for lunch, and every once in a while we'd go to the Nankin, which was the most preferred Chinese restaurant in Minneapolis at the time. So my brother Jim was born in 1955, and my brother Tom was born a couple years after that, and my brother Tim was born in 1960. So there was a span of 20 years from the time that my oldest brother, Pat, whose real name, by the way, was John Layard Fian, but we called him Pat because he was born on St. Patrick's Day. Pat was born in 1940. My sister Kit was born in 1941. I was born in 1945. My brother Kerry was born in 1948. I had a sister who was died as an infant, and Donna Marie, and I believe she was born in 1952. And as I mentioned, Jim was born in 1955. I think Tom was born in 1957, and Kerry was born in 1960. And so we had a large family, 7 kids, which was not all that unusual at the time. A lot of the kids that I went to school with, Our Lady of Victory, were from Catholic families, and some of them had 8, 9, and 10 kids. It was shortly after we had moved into the Mississippi courts that my mom wanted to get out of rental housing and buy a house, and I think my dad was agreeable. So we ended up buying a house just across the street from the courts on Lyndale, 5109 Lyndale. And that was a 2-bedroom house with actually with a finished attic where my grandmother slept, where Maida slept. And there were 2 bedrooms on the main floor. The one bedroom was shared by my mom and dad for a while, and then they actually slept in the living room part of the time on a day bed or pull-out bed. And us kids were split up between the 2 bedrooms. And that house was too small for the family, so eventually we moved to 5239. Actually, before it was 5239 Logan, that house was located on 3rd. It was 227 53rd Avenue North. And it was right on the city limits. It was as close to living in the suburbs as the law would allow, because my dad, as a fireman, had to live in the city. And I'm going to take a drink of tea right now. The cup that I'm using is one that I acquired very recently in Italy. Rita had taken me on a cruise to celebrate my 70th birthday, and we went to Barcelona to Monaco to a number of towns in Italy, including Pisa and Rome. And it was in one of these small towns along the way that I saw this blue cup and decided that would be a great cup to have as a souvenir. So, getting back to the family history, our great-grandfather, having homesteaded in Corcoran, was able to assemble, I think he had what they called a square, which is 240 acres, if I remember right, but then that got divided up between some of the boys as my grandfather passed away my great-grandfather passed away in 1913. And so the boys continued to live on the farm and work the farm for many years after that. And eventually they left and rented out the farm itself and the house to a neighbor by the name of Bill Kane, who continued to farm it for many years. Eventually what happened is the land passed to my Aunt Dessa and her husband Howard, and they put it in their will and left it to my mom and dad, and Mom and Dad decided to build a house out there. My brother Tom designed and built a house for them where they lived for probably 20 years, I would say, and until they both passed away. So I'm going to conclude this chapter right now, and the next one will be put up, chapter 2. You can find it on YouTube.